Many people claim to believe in a God who is compassionate and benevolent. And yet it's true, we do see an inordinate amount of suffering in the world around us, I'm sure you would agree. What I want to look at is what all this suffering says about God. And I'm sticking to suffering, not evil, because evil's a thing that we can get a little bit tripped up on. Some believe in evil as a thing in itself, things imbued with evil. I just use evil as an adjective. You can have an evil act, you can have an evil person. That's as far as I go with the concept of evil. I just want to define a couple of words, because people often say that their God is benevolent and compassionate. Let's look up the definitions of benevolence and compassion. Benevolence, the disposition to do good. Compassion, a feeling of sympathy and sorrow for another who is stricken by misfortune. Listen to the next bit. Alongside a strong desire to alleviate the suffering. Remember that bit, a strong desire to alleviate the suffering. Now, what suffering do we see if we take a Christian perspective? Well, I'm going to take a literalist Christian perspective. If you don't take a literalist Christian perspective, not all of these things will apply to your viewpoint, but some of them will. Let's start at Adam and Eve, who were created innocent. They didn't know good from bad. They didn't know right from wrong. But God still punished them when Adam disobeyed God. Don't know how he's supposed to know that he shouldn't disobey God, but he disobeyed God. God punishes him. Doesn't just punish him though, he punishes all of us, according to Christian literalists, all the way down to us now. If you want to go to heaven now, you have to repent for the sins, for your inherent sinful nature. Whose fault was that? Well, according to them, it's Adam. God has tarred us with that brush. He's made us all suffer for that sin of Adam. Maybe that's a little bit harsh. If we move on a bit, we come to Noah. This is probably the single most wicked act in the whole of humanity. Things were rather sinful. God decided to try and cure it by killing everybody on the earth. Okay, not quite everybody, he spared one family, but statistically speaking, it may as well be everybody on the earth. Drowning to death, flailing over a long period of time as the lactic acid takes over in your muscles as you try and stay with your head above the surface for hours, perhaps days, and then slowly disappearing under the water. The water starts to fill your lungs. Might be several minutes before you actually fall unconscious. It's a horrible way to go. God did that to everybody to alleviate sin. It didn't work. Just as sinful afterwards as before. But he did that if you believe the Old Testament. Of course, that might be the single most wicked act, but God also sends people to hell. The vast majority of people who have ever lived will be in hell. The vast majority of people alive now won't fulfill the criteria of truly accepting Jesus and repenting for their sins. They won't get that salvation. They will burn in hell. That is a lot of suffering. That's an eternity, an infinite amount of time of suffering for billions of people. On a day-to-day basis, we see all kinds of things. I've mentioned it in the past, the tsunami that wiped out over 200,000 people. Why didn't God intervene? Why did God allow that amount of human suffering? Again, people drowning, people having their lives destroyed, people losing all their relatives. God didn't actually even have to stop the water. He could have just put the thought in people's heads. He didn't even need to appear. Some people claim that God doesn't like to appear because he wants to allow us to show just how much faith we have by having faith in something that never shows itself. Didn't even have to appear though. All he had to do was put the thought in people's heads, go inland 10 miles for a couple of days, keep away from the coast. He could have spared all those lives. This kind of day-to-day suffering happens all the time, and it's not just to us innately sinful adults thanks to Adam. It also happens to newborn babies. It also happens to these unborn babies that Christians are so keen on protecting from abortion. God doesn't seem to matter about that. He terminates lots of pregnancies before they're even done. He doesn't seem to have any qualms about it. He doesn't seem to have any qualms about babies being born with horrible, painful disfigurements that are just going to allow them to stay alive for a few days or a few years in horrible discomfort and pain before they pass away. I've heard it stated that this is to allow their parents to demonstrate their faith. That seems a bit sick, to sacrifice somebody's life just to allow somebody else to demonstrate their faith. There does seem to be an awful lot of suffering going on here, and This is where we go back to these definitions of benevolence: the disposition to do good, compassion, a feeling of sympathy and sorrow for another who is stricken by misfortune, alongside a strong desire to alleviate the suffering. Let me ask you, does God fit either of those two definitions? I can't see any way in which he does, at all. The world is full of suffering, the world always has been full of suffering, and yet still people insist on using the terms benevolent and compassionate to describe their God. In fact, many Christians say that their God is omnibenevolent. I ask you, if you hold this kind of viewpoint, what possible definition do you have for the words benevolent and compassion in relation not to yourselves, or if you were talking about me or another person, but talking about your God? I further ask you, if all these acts, these tsunamis and earthquakes and babies born with horrible disfigurations and in agony, if none of these disprove the notion that your God is compassionate in the usual sense of the word, is there anything that you could theoretically give me as an example which, if it were to occur, would disprove the compassionate and benevolent nature of your God? Is your compassionate and benevolent God falsifiable in any kind of a way? Or would you just explain anything away in terms of God's compassion or his benevolence? Or, well, he must have some kind of reason why it's happening. Be interested to know what you think to that.